Sophia. Just say that name out loud for a second. Let it sit in the air. Most people hear that word and think of a girl's name. Maybe someone they went to school with. Maybe a character in a movie. But for the most powerful religious institution in human history, an institution that has survived empires, wars, plagues, and revolutions, that name is something else entirely. That name is a problem. And I don't mean a theological disagreement kind of problem. I mean a structural problem. A threat to the entire foundation kind of problem. Because if Sophia is real, if what the ancient texts say about her is true, then the version of spiritual history that has been handed to billions of people for almost 2,000 years is not just incomplete. It's a deliberate edit. Now, I know that sounds like the opening of a conspiracy thriller. And I want to be honest with you. I'm not here to sell you a conspiracy. I'm here to walk you through something that is documented, that is ancient, that is sitting in museums and university libraries and translated texts that anyone can read. The cover-up isn't hidden in the shadows. In a lot of ways, it's hiding in plain sight, and that's actually what makes it so extraordinary. Here's what I want you to understand before we go anywhere. This video is not for someone who is new to spirituality. You already know the basics. You've probably already felt that something is missing from the official story, whether that's the official religious story or the official materialist story that says consciousness is just a brain byproduct and wisdom is just a survival mechanism. You felt the gap. You've sensed there's something underneath the surface of things that doesn't have a name in the vocabulary you were given. I felt that gap too, for years. And then I encountered Sophia. Not in a religious context, not in a church or a theology book. I encountered her in a way that felt less like learning something new and more like remembering something I had always known but couldn't quite reach. That feeling, that specific feeling of recognition, is actually central to what Sophia is. And by the end of this video, I think you'll understand exactly what I mean by that. But let me tell you what this video is actually going to do. We're going to travel back, way back, to understand who Sophia really is, not as a myth, not as a metaphor, but as a living principle that certain ancient teachers said was fundamental to reality itself. We're going to look at what happened when that teaching collided with the early institutional church, and why the people in power decided it could not be allowed to survive. We're going to look at the prophecy, the actual prophecy from the actual texts that says she would return. And we're going to look at what that return looks like right now, in the world you and I are living in this specific moment in history. And then, and this is the part one care about most, we're going to go inward. Because the most important thing the ancient teachers said about Sophia wasn't about the cosmos. It was about you, about what's living inside you right now that has been systematically talked out of you, reasoned away from you, institutionalized out of your reach. That's the teaching they really wanted to bury. So let's begin. But before we go anywhere near the Vatican, we need to go somewhere much older. Picture Alexandria, 3rd century CE. Not the tourist Alexandria of today, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. A city where Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, Jewish scripture, and early Christian thought were all alive in the same streets, arguing with each other in the same marketplaces, bleeding into each other in the same schools. There is a man writing by lamplight. His name is not important right now. What matters is what he's doing. He is not writing theology. He is not constructing arguments to defend a doctrine. He is writing about something he experienced, something that moved through him like a current of warm water moving through cold. A kind of knowing that felt nothing like the knowing you get from reading a book or hearing a lecture. He writes, "She came to me not from outside but from within. She was the ground of my thinking before I thought anything. She was the light in which I saw, not the object I was seeing." He calls her Sophia. And that distinction he's making, the difference between Sophia as an object of belief and Sophia as the ground of awareness itself, that distinction is the entire key to understanding what we're actually talking about here. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. Most people know that much. But when the ancient Gnostic teachers used the word Sophia, they were not talking about wisdom the way we usually use it, as accumulated knowledge, as good judgment, as the kind of thing wise old people have because they've lived long enough. They were talking about something far more radical. They were talking about the divine intelligence that underlies reality itself. Not intelligence as in IQ. Not intelligence as in the ability to solve problems. Intelligence as in the structuring principle of existence. The reason the universe is coherent. The reason mathematics works. The reason there is pattern and beauty and meaning woven into the fabric of things at all. In Gnostic cosmology, Sophia is not a figure in a story. She is a cosmic force, an emanation. That's the word they used, from the ultimate divine source, which they called the monad or the first father, or simply the invisible. She is the living wisdom that flows outward from the divine center and gives shape to everything that exists. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting and genuinely esoteric. In Gnostic cosmology, the divine reality is not a single being sitting on a throne. It is a vast field of divine consciousness, and within that field there are emanations. Think of them as aspects or expressions of the divine, that together form what the Gnostics called the pleroma. The pleroma literally means the fullness. It is the complete, undivided divine reality. And Sophia is one of the highest and most powerful of these emanations. She is the last of the great divine principles, the one closest to the boundary between the divine world and everything else. And that position, right at the edge, is where the story begins. Because in the Gnostic myths, something happens to Sophia. She moves. She reaches. Some texts say she tries to know the ultimate Father directly, without her divine partner. An act of longing so intense it becomes an act of separation. And in that reaching she falls. Not morally. Not as a punishment. She falls the way a wave falls when it moves too far from the ocean. Not because it did something wrong, but because that's what happens when something of the infinite tries to extend itself into the finite without support. Now, I want to be clear about something here, because this is where most people get the story wrong. The fall of Sophia is not a story about feminine weakness or divine failure. The Gnostics were not setting up a narrative where Sophia is the problem and the male divine is the solution. That is absolutely not what's happening here. Esoterically, the fall of Sophia is a map. It's a map of how consciousness itself moves from unity into multiplicity, from the infinite into the finite, from pure being into the experience of separation and longing and eventual return. Sophia's story is not a tragedy. It is a cosmological process. And the most radical thing the Gnostic teachers taught was that this process is not just something that happened once, long ago, in the mythological beginning of things. It's happening in you, right now. The man writing by lamplight in Alexandria, he wasn't just a philosopher. He was part of a tradition that believed wisdom couldn't be handed to you from outside. It had to arise from within. It had to be lived into. And the figure of Sophia was the name they gave to that living, arising wisdom, the intelligence that is not taught but recognized. Now, I want to pause here and say something personally. When I first really understood this, not read it, but understood it, something shifted in me that hasn't shifted back. Because I had grown up in a world that was very good at giving me information and very bad at helping me develop wisdom. And the distinction between those two things, information on the outside, wisdom arising from within, felt like the most important thing anyone had ever tried to explain to me. And the fact that an entire tradition built around that distinction had been systematically erased from history felt, honestly, like a crime. Not a metaphorical crime, an actual crime against human consciousness. One of the most significant early teachers in this tradition was a man named Valentinus, and I want to give him his full weight for a moment, because he deserves it. Valentinus was a 2nd century Gnostic teacher whose school of thought was so sophisticated, so theologically developed, and so spiritually compelling that it nearly overtook what would become mainstream Christianity. He was educated in Alexandria, the same intellectual hothouse we started in. He eventually moved to Rome, where his school grew rapidly. Some historians believe he was nearly elected Bishop of Rome, which, if you think about what Rome became, means he nearly became the first pope. He didn't get elected, and the tradition he carried was eventually crushed. But what Valentinus taught about Sophia was this: she is not an external goddess to be worshipped. She is the inner life of wisdom itself, available to every human being who is willing to move past surface-level belief into genuine inner knowing. The term the Valentinians used for this was gnosis, not belief, not faith, but direct experiential knowledge of divine reality. And that teaching, more than anything else, is what made powerful people extremely nervous. Because if wisdom is something you can access directly, from within, without a priest, without a hierarchy, without an institution telling you what to believe, then what exactly do you need the institution for? That question, my friend, is the fault line that everything else runs along. But here's where it gets complicated and dangerous. Think about what it means when an institution decides that a teaching is not just wrong, but threatening. Not misguided, not confused, threatening. There's a difference. When something is merely wrong, you correct it. You explain why it's wrong. You write a counter-argument and move on. But when something is threatening, when it goes after the very foundation of your power, you don't argue with it. You erase it. And that is exactly what happened to Sophia. To understand how, you need to understand what was at stake in the first 3 centuries of Christian history. Because early Christianity was not a single unified thing. It was an explosion of diverse movements, all claiming the authority of Jesus, all with different texts, different practices, different understandings of what salvation actually meant and how it worked. Some of these movements were deeply mystical, experientially oriented, focused on direct inner transformation. Others were more communal, more doctrinal, more focused on correct belief and external practice. The Gnostic Christians, the ones who carried the Sophia tradition, were firmly in the first camp. And the Proto-Orthodox Christians, the ones who would eventually win, were firmly in the second. One of the most important figures in the war against the Sophia tradition was a man named Irenaeus of Lyon. I want you to know who this man was, because his influence on what you were and weren't allowed to believe is almost incalculable. Irenaeus was a 2nd century bishop who wrote a massive 5-volume work called Adversus Heresies, Against Heresies. It is essentially the first systematic attack on Gnostic Christianity ever written. And it is ferocious. Irenaeus goes through Gnostic teachings point by point and dismantles them, not just theologically but rhetorically. He mocks them. He makes them sound bizarre, elitist, sexually immoral, spiritually dangerous. Now here's what's fascinating, and this tells you everything you need to know. Irenaeus doesn't argue against Gnosis by proving it's wrong. He argues against it by proving it's divisive. His core complaint is not that the Gnostic Christians have bad theology. His core complaint is that they think they have access to wisdom that ordinary believers don't have, that there is an inner circle, that direct experience of divine reality is even possible without the mediation of the church. That, to Irenaeus, was the real heresy. Because you see, the institutional model of Christianity that was emerging required a specific architecture. It required clergy who stood between the divine and the ordinary believer. It required scripture that was fixed and controlled. It required doctrine that was decided by councils of bishops, not by individual mystical experience. A tradition that said you can know God directly, from within, through the awakening of Sophia's light inside you. That tradition didn't just challenge one belief or another. It challenged the entire model. So what did they do? The strategy had several stages. First, redefine. Take the diversity of Christian texts circulating in the first 3 centuries and draw a hard line between scripture and heresy. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, called by the Emperor Constantine, is usually talked about as the moment when Christianity got its official creed. And that's true. But what's talked about far less is what was left out. Not by accident, by decision. Texts that carried the Sophia tradition, texts that described direct inner knowing as the path to salvation, texts that portrayed the divine in feminine as well as masculine terms. These were not included in what became the official canon. They were excluded. And then, over the following centuries, they were actively destroyed. Libraries were burned. Manuscripts were seized. Communities that continued practicing the older mystical traditions were persecuted. For roughly 1,700 years, the Sophia tradition was essentially gone from the Western world. You couldn't read her texts because they didn't exist in any accessible form. All you had was what Irenaeus and his successors said about her, which was predictably not flattering. And then in December 1945, a farmer in Upper Egypt swung a mattock into the earth and changed everything. His name was Muhammad Ali al-Salman, and he was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, close to the town of Nag Hammadi. He struck a large sealed clay jar buried in the ground. He hesitated. His mother later said he was afraid of a jinn, an evil spirit, and almost didn't open it. But hunger is a powerful motivator. He thought it might contain gold. He broke the jar open. What he found was not gold. What he found was 13 leather-bound codices, ancient books, containing 52 texts in the Coptic language. Texts that had been sealed and buried, probably by monks from a nearby monastery, sometime in the late 4th century. Probably buried to save them from destruction during the very purges that Irenaeus' tradition had set in motion. These were the Nag Hammadi texts, and they were the Sophia tradition, preserved in the dark for 17 centuries, waiting. James Robinson, the American biblical scholar who led the first complete English translation team for the Nag Hammadi Library, one of the most important translation projects of the 20th century, said that the discovery was nothing less than a revolution in our understanding of early Christianity. He spent decades of his life on those texts, and what he found confirmed something that mainstream scholarship had long preferred to ignore. The Gnostic tradition was not a fringe aberration of early Christianity. It was a central, sophisticated, deeply developed stream of thought that had been deliberately cut out of the historical record. Now, I want to be honest about what I believe here. I don't think this was carelessness. I don't think the early church fathers simply got confused about which texts were legitimate and which weren't. The deliberateness of the erasure, the systematic mockery, the burning of libraries, the persecution of communities, tells you that the people doing it understood exactly what they were erasing and why. They knew that the Sophia tradition represented a fundamentally different model of spirituality, one that didn't need them, and they made sure it disappeared. That's not theology, that's politics. But here's what they couldn't erase. The prophecy. December 1945. Upper Egypt. Muhammad Ali al-Salman brings his mattock down on the dry earth near Jabal al-Tarif and strikes something hard. He kneels in the dirt. He clears the earth with his hands. There's a large sealed clay jar, about 60 centimeters tall, buried just below the surface. He stands up. He looks around. There's nobody else here. Just the cliffs, the sand, the white Egyptian sky. His brother is with him, a few meters away. He's afraid. He genuinely is. In the local folk tradition, sealed jars buried in the ground sometimes contain spirits, jinn, that can possess or harm whoever opens them. His mother later confirms this. He almost walks away. He almost leaves that jar in the earth where it has sat for 1,500 years. But he is also hungry, and his family is poor. And if there's gold in that jar, he raises the mattock and brings it down. The clay shatters. No gold. No spirit. Just leather. Old, dark, brittle leather wrapped around something. He pulls it out carefully. There are more beneath it. 13 bundles. He stacks them. He doesn't know yet what he's holding. He doesn't know that the texts sealed inside these leather covers have not been read by human eyes since roughly 390 CE. He doesn't know that they were buried, deliberately hidden, by someone who understood they were preserving something that powerful people wanted destroyed. He carries them home. His mother uses some of the loose papyrus pages as kindling for her stove. History is sometimes heartbreaking, but enough survives. Enough survives to change everything. Among the texts recovered from that jar and its companions are two documents that I want to focus on right now. Because these two documents contain something extraordinary. They contain what I can only describe as the voice of Sophia herself. Not described by someone else. Not interpreted through a theologian's framework. Her voice. Speaking directly. The first text is called the Thunder, Perfect Mind. The second is called Trimorphic Protonoia, which translates roughly as the triple-formed primal thought. Let me tell you what these texts actually are, because nothing I can say will quite prepare you for the experience of reading them, if you haven't already. The Thunder, Perfect Mind is written in the first person. It is Sophia, or the divine feminine principle, the cosmic wisdom, speaking directly. And she speaks in paradoxes. She says, I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. She says, I am the silence that is incomprehensible. I am the utterance of my name. Now, I know those lines can sound like poetry, beautiful but vague. But the scholars who have studied this text most closely say it is not poetry in the decorative sense. It is a revelation document. It is structured the way the Hebrew prophets structured divine speech. And what it is revealing is this: the divine wisdom that was cast out, that was exiled, that was buried, is not gone. She is present in all the contradictions of existence. She is hidden in the margins, in the forgotten places, in the very things that the powerful call shameful or low or unworthy. And she is speaking. Trimorphic Protonoia goes further. In this text, the divine feminine principle describes herself as descending into the world 3 times. The first descent is as voice, pure sound, pure vibration, the underlying hum of existence. The second descent is as speech, meaning logos, the structuring of the voice into intelligible reality. The third descent is as word made flesh, a direct entry into material existence, into the human world, to awaken the sleeping sparks of divine light that are trapped in matter. 3 descents, each one more intimate than the last, each one a deeper entry into the world of human experience. Now, here is what I believe, and I want to be direct about this, is the actual prophecy embedded in these texts. She is not describing something that happened once in the distant past. She is describing a recurring pattern, a cycle. The divine wisdom descends. It gets buried. The material world, with its hierarchies and its power structures and its addiction to control, tries to silence it. And then it descends again, and then again, each time more fully, each time reaching more deeply into human consciousness. The prophecy is not, Sophia will return on a specific date. The prophecy is, she cannot be permanently suppressed. Every time you bury her, she descends again, more completely than before. That is the prophecy that trimorphic protonoia carries. And here's where Carl Jung enters the conversation, because I think his reading of these texts is one of the most important things a 20th century thinker ever produced. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and the founder of analytical psychology. But more than that, he was a man who spent 11 years of his life reading Gnostic and alchemical texts with the kind of obsessive attention usually reserved for sacred scripture. He didn't read them as history. He read them as maps of the psyche. And what he said about Sophia was this: the Western psyche has been amputated. The suppression of the feminine divine in Western Christianity created a wound in the collective unconscious, a wound that has been leaking for 2,000 years in the form of projection, violence, and the inability to integrate what we don't understand. And his prognosis? The psyche compensates. Always. Suppress something long enough and it doesn't disappear. It goes underground, builds pressure, and eventually erupts. Sophia returning, for Jung, wasn't a theological statement. It was a psychological inevitability. Now let me show you the cosmic framework underneath all of this, because the Gnostic teachers were not just talking about psychological patterns. They were talking about time itself. In esoteric cosmology, across multiple traditions, time is not linear. It moves in great cycles. The most relevant cycle here is the precession of the equinoxes, the approximately 26,000-year cycle caused by the wobble of the Earth's axis, which moves the zodiacal backdrop of the spring equinox through all 12 signs. Each sign governs roughly 2,160 years. We have been in the age of Pisces, the age of the fish, the age of institutional religion, of hierarchical faith, of top-down spiritual authority, for approximately 2,000 years. We are now at the boundary. The age of Aquarius, associated with the awakening of inner knowing, the democratization of wisdom, the return of direct spiritual experience, is beginning. The Gnostic teachers who encoded these prophecies were working with exactly this framework. The return of Sophia was not an arbitrary event. It was timed to the turning of the Great Age. When the age of institutional religious authority begins to collapse under its own weight, that is when the buried tradition resurfaces. That is when the sealed jar gets opened. Muhammad Ali al-Salman opened that jar in December 1945. Think about what was happening in the world in 1945. I'll let you sit with that for a moment. I want to be careful here, because the easiest thing in the world, the laziest thing, would be to frame the Vatican as a cartoon villain in this story. The shadowy institution, the power-hungry men in robes, the evil empire suppressing the truth. That framing is satisfying. It's also incomplete. Here's how I actually think about the Vatican, and about institutional religion in general. The Vatican is an institution whose entire spiritual, theological, and political architecture is built on a specific story. A specific account of what God is, what salvation means, who Jesus was, and how divine authority flows in the world. That story has sustained billions of people across 2 millennia. It has produced art, philosophy, hospitals, universities. It has given comfort to people in their most desperate moments. I am not dismissing any of that. But here's the thing about institutions built on a specific story. When a counter-story appears, especially one with ancient authority, especially one with textual evidence, especially one that offers an equally coherent but fundamentally different account of reality, the institution doesn't engage with it curiously. It can't afford to, because if the counter-story is taken seriously, the entire architecture built on the original story becomes unstable. That is not a conspiracy. That is the logic of institutional self-preservation. And once you understand that logic, the Vatican's behavior around the Sophia tradition makes perfect sense. Let's look at it across time. The ancient response we've already covered, the burning of texts, the persecution of communities, the systematic theological attack mounted by figures like Irenaeus. But what about the modern response? Because the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in 1945. That was 80 years ago. 80 years is long enough for the Vatican, one of the most sophisticated intellectual institutions in human history, with a library that contains millions of documents, to have issued a serious theological response to what those texts contain. They haven't. The silence itself is a statement, but the silence hasn't been total. There have been calculated moves. And the most interesting one came in 1988, when Pope John Paul II issued an apostolic letter called Mulieris Dignitatem, on the dignity and vocation of women. On the surface, it was a thoughtful, even moving document about the role of the feminine in Catholic theology and in the life of Mary. Feminist scholars were initially cautiously hopeful. Then they read it carefully. What Mulieris Dignitatem actually does is take the energy of the divine feminine, the growing cultural and spiritual hunger for a feminine face of God that was clearly building in the late 20th century, and very carefully, very skillfully redirect it back into the figure of Mary. Not Sophia, not the cosmic wisdom principle. Mary, a human woman, a vessel, honored, yes, elevated, yes, but safely contained within the existing theological framework. Several scholars called it immediately for what it was, not an opening but a containment strategy. Then, in the year 2000, right at the moment when Gnostic scholarship was beginning to really penetrate public consciousness, the Vatican issued a document called Dominus Iesus. Its message was stark: the Catholic Church is the one true path to salvation. Other religious traditions are gravely deficient. There is no valid spiritual authority outside the Church's mediated structure. Think about the timing of that. 55 years after the Nag Hammadi discovery, right as books like Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels were being read by millions, right as the alternative history of early Christianity was becoming impossible to ignore for educated people. Dominus Iesus was not a theological document issued in a vacuum. It was a response, a reassertion, a closing of ranks. Now I want to tell you about someone most people have never heard of, a man named Hans Urs von Balthasar. Von Balthasar was a Swiss Catholic theologian, and Pope John Paul II considered him the greatest Catholic theologian of the 20th century. That's not a small claim. Von Balthasar actually tried to do something extraordinary. He attempted to bring Sophia back into Catholic theology. Not the Gnostic Sophia, not the full cosmic force described in the Nag Hammadi texts, but a version of Sophia that could be contained within Orthodox doctrine. He called this theodrama, a cosmic narrative in which the divine wisdom plays a role alongside the Trinity. His attempt failed, not because it was theologically incompetent. Von Balthasar was brilliant. It failed because you cannot bring Sophia halfway into a room and expect her to sit quietly in the corner. The very nature of what Sophia represents, direct inner knowing, divine wisdom accessible without institutional mediation, is incompatible with the structures that institutional religion depends on. You can dress her up in Orthodox language. You can call her something safer. But what she actually is keeps showing through. And then in 2003, a novelist named Dan Brown published the Da Vinci Code. Now, I'm not saying the Da Vinci Code is a reliable historical document. It's a thriller. It plays fast and loose with a lot of things. But what it did, accidentally or deliberately, was bring the suppressed feminine in Christian history into the living rooms of about 80 million readers. The response from the Vatican was interesting. Not the loud denunciation you might expect. Something more measured, more careful. A series of official clarifications. Books commissioned. Documentaries authorized. Nervous energy, dressed up as calm. Here's what I honestly think. An institution that was completely secure in its foundation would not be rattled by a novel. The fact that the Da Vinci Code provoked any official response at all tells you something about where the pressure points are. Esoterically, there is a distinction in the Gnostic texts that I think the Vatican understands very well, even if it doesn't use this language. The Gnostics distinguished between two aspects of Sophia. Sophia Achamoth, the lower Sophia, the fallen wisdom, the one who descended into matter and became confused. And Sophia Propator, the higher Sophia, the original Divine Mother, still seated in the pleroma, still radiating the fullness of divine wisdom. The Vatican can tolerate Sophia Achamoth, a fallen, confused, lost feminine principle that needs to be rescued and corrected. That actually fits quite well into a certain theological framework. It maps onto Eve, onto the fallen feminine that requires redemption through masculine divine intervention. What the Vatican cannot tolerate is Sophia Propator, the original Divine Mother. the wisdom principle that is co-equal with, or in some texts prior to, the masculine divine. Because that Sophia doesn't need to be rescued. She doesn't need a hierarchy. She doesn't need a priest or a pope to stand between her and the human soul. She comes directly. She always has. And that, my friend, is the real threat. Picture the city of Girona, in the Castile region of Spain. It is the late 13th century. The streets smell of wood smoke and animals. The political situation is complicated. It always is in medieval Iberia, where three traditions live in uneasy proximity. And in a scriptorium somewhere in this world, a man is writing in Aramaic in near total secrecy. His name is Moses de Leon. He's a Jewish mystic, scholarly, brilliant, operating in a world where mystical speculation is not always encouraged even within his own tradition. What he is writing will circulate at first anonymously, then under a false attribution to a revered ancient rabbi, a protective fiction. Eventually it will be recognized as one of the most spiritually significant texts in the history of Jewish thought. It is called the Zohar, the Book of Radiance, and it is the foundational text of Kabbalah. Hidden within its dense, luminous Aramaic prose is a feminine divine principle. Not as a footnote, not as a symbol, as a living presence. She is called the Shekinah, a Hebrew word meaning the indwelling or the dwelling presence. She is the aspect of God that enters the world, that is present in matter. That is, in Kabbalistic theology, currently in exile, separated from the divine masculine, the holy blessed one, by the brokenness of the world, wandering, waiting for the reunification that will come when enough human beings do the inner work of repair, tikkun olam. Does that story sound familiar? Sophia falls from the pleroma. She wanders in the darkness of matter. She waits for the return. The Shekinah is exiled from God. She wanders in the world. She waits for the reunification. Same pattern. Different language. Different century. Different tradition. That is not a coincidence. I'm not capable of calling that a coincidence. And once you see this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Turn back further. Open the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Turn to Proverbs 8. And read slowly, because this passage is extraordinary. In it, a female figure called Chakma, the Hebrew word for wisdom, speaks. She says, "I was there when God laid the foundations of the earth. I was beside him like a master craftsman. I was his delight day by day, rejoicing in his presence." She describes herself as present before creation. She says she existed before the mountains were formed, before the seas were given their boundaries. She is not a creation of God. She is a companion of God. She is, in a very meaningful sense, co-eternal with God. This is not a minor passage. This is one of the most theologically explosive texts in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it has been consistently underplayed, minimized, and reinterpreted in ways that sand down its radical edges. Because if wisdom, if Sophia, if Chakma, was there at the foundation of creation, was the delight of God, was the craftsman through whom creation took shape, then the divine is not simply masculine. The divine is at minimum dual. At minimum. That is the reading the tradition doesn't want you to make. Now move into Eastern Christianity, into the great Orthodox tradition that split from Rome in 1054. Here's something remarkable. The greatest church in the history of Christendom, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, built by the Emperor Justinian in 537 CE, the church that was for nearly 1,000 years the largest building in the world, is not dedicated to a saint. It is dedicated to the holy wisdom, Hagia Sophia. And the early Orthodox theologians who used this name were not using it as a vague metaphor for God's general wisdom. They were referencing something specific, a divine principle, a living reality. The Orthodox tradition has always had a more complex relationship with Sophia than Western Catholicism. It has more room for mysticism, for direct inner experience, for the apophatic tradition, the tradition of approaching God through what cannot be said. And within that space, Sophia survived. The most serious attempt in the 20th century to restore Sophia fully to Christian theology came from a Russian Orthodox theologian and priest named Sergei Bulgakov, one of the most brilliant and courageous theological minds of his era. Bulgakov developed what he called Sophiology, a full theological account of Sophia as a living divine principle, present in the Trinity, the ground of creation, the cosmic wisdom that bridges the divine and the human. His work was sophisticated, careful, scripturally grounded, and deeply compelling. The Moscow Patriarchate condemned it. The official charge was deviation from Orthodox doctrine. But what Bulgakov was really guilty of was taking Sophia seriously enough to let her be what she actually is, which, inevitably, disrupts the existing theological architecture. Even in the tradition most hospitable to her, she was too much. Now move into the Hermetic and alchemical traditions, the underground river of Western esoteric thought that has flowed continuously from late antiquity through the Renaissance and into modernity. In this tradition, the feminine divine appears under the Latin name sapientia, wisdom. She is the hidden principle in the alchemical opus, the great work. The alchemists were not trying to turn lead into gold, or not only that, they were describing an inner transformation, a process by which the lead of unconscious, unexamined existence is transmuted into the gold of awakened wisdom. And the force that drives that transmutation, that catalyzes the process, that provides the intelligence behind the transformation, that is sapientia. That is Sophia. She never went away. Not from Kabbalah, not from the Hebrew scriptures, not from Eastern Orthodox mysticism, not from the alchemical tradition. She just changed her clothes. She adapted to whatever language could carry her without getting her killed. And then, there is Mary Magdalene. The Pistis Sophia, one of the most complete Gnostic manuscripts ever recovered, its title meaning literally faith wisdom, presents a picture of Mary Magdalene that is absolutely nothing like the figure most people know. In this text, the risen Christ is speaking with his disciples, and Mary Magdalene asks more questions, deeper questions, more penetrating questions, than all the male disciples combined. The text says explicitly that she understands his teachings more fully than any other. It says she is the one whose heart is more directed to the kingdom of heaven than all her brothers. She is not a follower. She is not a supporting character. In this text, Mary Magdalene is the one who carries Sophia's light most fully in human form. She is the embodiment of divine wisdom in the earthly plane. She is, in the language of the tradition, the human Sophia. And what did the institutional church do with her? In 591 CE, Pope Gregory I, one of the most politically shrewd men to ever sit in the papal chair, delivered a sermon in which he deliberately merged three separate women from the New Testament into one single figure, Mary Magdalene. He took Mary of Bethany, who anointed Jesus' feet. He took the unnamed sinful woman from Luke, and he merged them both with Mary Magdalene, creating a composite figure who was now, officially, a reformed prostitute. There is zero scriptural basis for this. The New Testament never calls Mary Magdalene a prostitute, never implies it, never suggests it. The Catholic Church itself officially reversed Gregory's identification in 1969, quietly, with almost no fanfare. But the damage was done. 1,400 years of the story. 1,400 years of the woman, who may have been the most spiritually advanced figure in the early Christian community, being remembered as a fallen woman who needed saving. That is not a theological error. That is the suppression of Sophia in human form. Now I want to say something directly. When you look at all of this together, the Shekinah, the Chakma of Proverbs, the Hagia Sophia, the Sapientia of the alchemists, the Mary Magdalene of the Gnostic texts, you are not looking at a collection of coincidences. You are looking at a single pattern, appearing again and again across different cultures, different languages, different centuries. A pattern of divine feminine wisdom being recognized, being named, being described as fundamental to reality, and then being suppressed, marginalized, erased, or redirected into something safer. She never left. She just kept finding new ways to speak. And now I want to show you something that almost nobody talks about, because it lives in plain sight. I want you to imagine something. You're standing inside a Gothic cathedral. Maybe it's Chartres in France. Maybe it's Notre Dame in Paris. Maybe it's Cologne in Germany. Wherever it is, you're standing inside this vast stone space and you're looking up. The light coming through the stained glass is that particular kind of light that doesn't exist anywhere else, colored, liquid, alive. The stone seems to breathe. There's a quality of silence in these buildings that is different from ordinary silence. Denser, more intentional. Now I want you to look more carefully, because the people who built these buildings were not just building churches. They were encoding something. And once you know what to look for, you cannot unknow it. Let's start with the most obvious one. The Virgin Mary, in virtually every Gothic cathedral in Europe, is depicted in blue. Not just any blue. A specific, extraordinary shade of deep blue made from ground lapis lazuli, a mineral that in the medieval period had to be imported all the way from mines in Afghanistan. It was ounce for ounce more expensive than gold. Painters used it exclusively for Mary's robe, never for background scenery. never for decorative elements, only for her. Why? In the esoteric tradition running through the ancient world, from Egypt to Greece to the Gnostic communities of Alexandria, deep blue is the color of the night sky, of the cosmic feminine, of the infinite void from which creation emerges. It is the color of Isis in Egypt. It is the color associated with the Divine Mother principle across multiple traditions. The medieval craftsmen who chose this color for Mary were not making an aesthetic decision. They were making a statement. They were saying, this figure, this Mary, stands in the place that was once occupied by something much older, by a divine feminine principle that the cosmos itself carries. Whether they fully knew what they were encoding is another question. But it's there. Now look at the Black Madonna. Across Europe, from Poland to France to Spain to Switzerland to Germany, there are over 400 Black Madonna statues. Some of them are the most venerated religious objects in their respective countries. The Black Madonna of Czestochowa in Poland, the Black Madonna of Montserrat in Spain, the Black Madonna of Einsiedeln in Switzerland. These figures are dark-skinned, not from age, not from candle smoke. That's an explanation scholars have largely discredited, but deliberately, originally dark. And the sites where they are found are, with remarkable consistency, sites of pre-Christian goddess worship. Ancient sacred places, springs, caves, hilltops, that were holy before Christianity arrived. When Christianity came, the goddess didn't disappear. She went underground, sometimes literally. She became Mary. But she kept her dark skin. She kept her ancient power. Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, British researchers and the authors of the Templar Revelation, the book that partly inspired Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, spent years documenting the pattern of goddess site to Mary site conversion across Europe. What they found was a systematic process of spiritual appropriation. The church built churches on the sites of goddess worship, dedicated them to Mary, and absorbed the spiritual power of the place while redirecting the devotion. The goddess was never destroyed. She was rebranded. Now look at the building itself. The name Notre Dame, Our Lady. Who's Lady? The official answer is Mary, the mother of Jesus. But ask the question more carefully. These cathedrals were built in the 12th and 13th centuries by builders, stonemasons, architects, who were steeped in the Hermetic tradition, in alchemical symbolism, in the esoteric knowledge that ran alongside and underneath official doctrine. When they called the cathedral Our Lady, who were they honoring? And here's the detail I find most extraordinary. Walk through the main entrance of almost any major Gothic cathedral and look at the shape of the doorway, not the decorative carving around it, but the geometric shape of the arch itself. In Gothic architecture, the dominant arch form is the pointed arch, the ogive. But the frame of the entrance, when you look at it from outside, often forms a specific shape. Two arcs of circles intersecting to create an almond-shaped void in the center, called in sacred geometry the vesica piscis. The vesica piscis is one of the most ancient symbols in human geometric thought. It appears in Pythagorean mathematics, in Hermetic symbolism, in early Christian art. And its esoteric meaning, across virtually all of these traditions, is the same. It is the symbol of the feminine creative principle, of the womb of creation, of the opening through which the divine enters the material world. It is the geometric expression of Sophia, the feminine intelligence through which form comes into being. It is carved into the entrance of the buildings that officially deny her existence. I am not a person who sees conspiracy everywhere. I actually resist that kind of thinking. I find it intellectually lazy most of the time. But I will tell you this. The first time I noticed the vesica piscis carved into the entrance of a cathedral and understood what it meant, something in my chest went very still. Not because I thought I'd caught someone in a lie, but because I suddenly understood that the people who built these buildings knew something they couldn't say out loud. And they found a way to say it in stone, in geometry, in color, in the precise placement of sacred symbols that only someone who knew what to look for would recognize. They preserved Sophia in the architecture of the very buildings that officially rejected her. And once you see that, once you understand that the suppression was never total, that she was always present in the hidden language of sacred art and architecture, the next question becomes the most important one. If she never really left, what does her return actually look like? Let me speak to you directly right now. No historical context. No ancient texts. Just this moment and what's happening in it. Something is shifting. You can feel it. I think that's part of why you're watching a video like this. The old structures of spiritual authority are not just declining. They are fracturing in ways that feel qualitatively different from any previous period of religious change. The statistics on institutional religious membership in the Western world are not a slow downward trend. They are a cliff edge. In the United States, the percentage of people who identify as religiously unaffiliated, the so-called knowns, has gone from roughly 5% in 1972 to over 30% in 2024. In Western Europe, the numbers are more dramatic still. But here's what I find far more interesting than those numbers. It's not that people are becoming more atheist. Most of the people leaving institutional religion are not concluding that spirituality is a delusion. They are concluding that the institution is not the right vehicle for it. They are hungry for direct experience. They are looking for inner transformation, not doctrinal compliance. They are seeking wisdom, not theological authority. That is not secularism. That is, in the most precise sense, a Gnostic impulse. The explosion of interest in Gnostic scholarship over the last 30 years has been remarkable, and it's not staying in universities. Elaine Pagels, professor of religion at Princeton University, and the scholar who won the National Book Award for the Gnostic Gospels in 1979, the first major work to bring the Nag Hammadi texts to a mainstream audience, has said that she believes this knowledge is surfacing now because it needs to. Not in a mystical sense, in a practical sense, because the questions that Gnostic Christianity was built around. How do I know God directly? What is the nature of my own inner life? Is wisdom something I have to be taught or something I have to awaken? Those questions have not gone away in 2,000 years. They have just been suppressed. And suppressed things find new channels. The reemergence of contemplative practice in the Western world is extraordinary to me. Meditation, once considered an Eastern import, exotic, marginal, is now practiced by tens of millions of people across Europe and America. Not because they were told to by a religious authority, because they discovered through direct experience that it does something. It changes the quality of inner life. It opens access to a kind of knowing that is not intellectual. And the people who practice it consistently report something that the Gnostics would have recognized immediately: the sense of an inner intelligence, an inner clarity, that is not the same as their normal thinking. Something deeper. Something that seems to know things that the surface mind doesn't know. They don't have a word for it, but the Gnostics did. Sophia. Now I want to give you the psychological framework for understanding why this is happening now, why this specific historical moment, because I don't think it's random. Carl Jung developed a concept called enantiodromia. It's a Greek term. He borrowed it from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, and it refers to a fundamental law of psychological and perhaps cosmic reality. When any force is suppressed long enough and completely enough, it does not disappear. It builds. It accumulates energy in the unconscious, in the shadow, as Jung called it, and eventually, it erupts with a force proportional to how long and how thoroughly it was suppressed. 2,000 years. 2,000 years of the divine feminine being systematically removed from Western consciousness. 2,000 years of wisdom traditions that valued inner knowing being condemned, burned, driven underground. 2,000 years of a spiritual architecture built entirely on masculine divine imagery, masculine authority structures, masculine models of salvation. Enantiodromia says that cannot hold forever, and the pressure that has been building for 2,000 years is, according to this principle, going to produce a return that is proportionally powerful. What I believe, and I'm being honest with you about this, not presenting it as established fact, is that what we are living through right now is that eruption. Not in a cataclysmic, dramatic sense. In a quiet, pervasive, impossible-to-stop sense. The hunger for inner wisdom. The collapse of spiritual authority structures. The return of contemplative practice. The explosion of interest in exactly the traditions, Gnostic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, mystical, that have always carried Sophia under different names. This is what the return of Sophia looks like. It doesn't look like a goddess appearing in the sky. It looks like millions of people, independently, simultaneously, turning inward and finding something there that the official story told them was not available. And the Vatican's 80-year silence on the Nag Hammadi texts, 80 years from 1945 to now, tells you something profound. The most sophisticated theological institution in human history has had 8 decades to respond to the discovery of the most important cache of alternative Christian texts ever found. Texts that came from within the early Christian world. Texts that predate or are contemporary with the texts that became the official New Testament. And the response has been nothing. Not engagement. Not refutation. Not serious theological dialogue. Silence. And silence, in an institution that has been commenting on theology for 2,000 years, is not neutrality. It is a choice. It is the choice to hope that if you don't acknowledge something, maybe it will go away. Sophia is not going away. But there's one more layer. And this one is personal. Because it's about you. There is a classroom in Rome. The year is approximately 160 CE. The room is not grand. It's a rented space above a shop, the way many early Christian communities met. The teacher is elderly, precise in his movements, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of inner practice. His students are mixed, men and women, Greek speakers and Latin speakers, some from wealthy families, some freed slaves. The teacher is a student of Valentinus's tradition. And today he is saying something that, if the wrong person hears it, could get him killed. He says, "The kingdom of heaven is not a place that awaits you after death. It is not a reward for correct belief. It is a state of consciousness that you grow into, and it is already latent within you, hidden in the deepest part of your being, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow." One of his students asks, "How do we reach it?" The teacher is quiet for a long moment. Then he says, "You stop looking outside yourself for it." That teaching, 5 words, is the most dangerous thing the Gnostic tradition ever produced. Because it doesn't just challenge a doctrine. It challenges the entire premise of institutional religion. If the kingdom is within, if wisdom is not dispensed from outside but awakened from within, then the entire apparatus of external religious authority becomes not just unnecessary, but an obstacle. That is why it was suppressed. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right and too dangerous. Let me lay out the actual esoteric teaching, because this is the heart of everything we've been building toward. In Gnostic cosmology, every human being carries within them a pneuma, a Greek word meaning spirit or breath, but in the Gnostic context meaning specifically a spark of divine light. This spark is not metaphorical. The Gnostics meant it literally, or as literally as something non-material can be described in literal terms. When Sophia descended and her light fragmented into the material world, those fragments became the innermost essence of each human being. The deepest center of you, underneath the personality, underneath the ego, underneath all the thoughts and stories and identities that you carry, is a fragment of Sophia's light. And it is trying to return. Not after you die. Not in some future cosmic event. Now. Constantly. The yearning that humans feel, the hunger for meaning, for depth, for genuine connection, for something beyond the surface of ordinary life, the Gnostics would say, that is the pneuma. That is Sophia's light recognizing its own nature and trying to move back toward its source. The word they used for the process of this recognition was gnosis. Not belief, not faith, knowing. Direct, experiential, unmistakable knowing of what you actually are. This is the teaching they most wanted gone. Because it doesn't require them. A belief system requires external authority to tell you what to believe and whether you believe it correctly. But gnosis, the direct inner recognition of Sophia's light within you, cannot be controlled from outside. You can suppress the teaching. You can burn the texts. You can condemn the tradition. But you cannot go inside a person's innermost consciousness and extinguish the spark that's already there. You can only make sure they never learn it exists, which is exactly what was done. Now, there is one more Gnostic teaching I want to give you, because it is perhaps the most misunderstood and the most profound. It appears in the Gnostic texts under the name of the bridal chamber mystery. When people first encounter this term, they often assume it's about physical intimacy. It's not, or rather, it uses the language of intimacy to point to something that happens entirely within a single consciousness. In Gnostic esotericism, every human being contains both masculine and feminine principles. Not in a social sense, not about gender roles. In a metaphysical sense, the masculine principle within you is the quality of directed awareness, of discernment, of the light of consciousness itself. The feminine principle, Sophia, is the quality of receptive knowing, of deep intuition, of wisdom that arises from within rather than being constructed from outside. In most people, in most moments, these two inner principles are not in union. The masculine principle, the thinking, analyzing, directing mind, dominates. The feminine principle, the deep inner wisdom, the Sophia spark, is suppressed, unheard, buried. The bridal chamber mystery is the inner alchemy by which these two principles are brought into conscious union within a single person. When that union happens, when the directed light of your awareness turns fully inward and genuinely meets the Sophia spark at your core. The Gnostics say that is gnosis. That is the moment of recognition. That is what the man writing by lamplight in Alexandria was pointing toward when he said, "She came to me not from outside, but from within." And here's where Simone Weil enters this conversation, because I think her work points toward the same reality from a completely different direction. Weil was a French philosopher, mystic, and activist, one of the most original and uncompromising spiritual thinkers of the 20th century, someone who refused to join any institution, religious or political, because she trusted her own direct experience over any external authority. She developed a concept she called decreation, a process of stripping away the false self, the ego-constructed personality, the accumulated layers of opinion and desire and self-protection, until what remains is the naked attention of consciousness itself. Open, still, receptive. She didn't use the language of Sophia, but what she describes, the stillness beneath the noise of the self, the quality of pure attention that can see clearly because it has no agenda, is the same thing the Gnostics were pointing toward. The opened inner space where Sophia can be recognized. Now let me be honest with you about something personal. I am not a mystic in any grand sense of the word. I don't have visions. I don't have moments of dramatic cosmic illumination that I can describe to you. What I have had repeatedly, over years of sitting in genuine stillness, in genuine interior quiet, is the experience of a quality of knowing that is not my normal thinking. A clarity that arrives when I stop trying to figure things out and simply become still enough to listen. It doesn't feel supernatural. It feels more natural than anything else I experience. It feels like what is actually there when everything I've added on top of it stops making so much noise. I don't know what to call that scientifically. I'm not going to pretend I do. But I know what the ancient teachers called it, and that knowing, that recognition, is the most personally transforming thing I have encountered in my life. Not because it answered my questions, but because it showed me that the deepest questions don't need answers from outside. They need a quality of attention from within. That is the inner Sophia, and that is the teaching they really, truly, most fundamentally wanted to bury. Because a person who can access that, who knows from direct experience, that wisdom is not dispensed from outside but recognized from within, is a person who cannot be fully controlled, who cannot be fully institutionalized, who carries something inside them that no authority can take away. That is not a small thing. Now I want to bring this all the way home, because the prophecy isn't just about what's happening in the world. It's about what's happening in this very moment. Let me speak plainly. No narrative setup, no historical framing, just you and me and what I actually believe is happening. We are living through the fulfillment of the prophecy, not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not lightning from the sky, not a sudden global awakening, not a single moment you can point to and say, there, that's when it happened. The text never described it that way. The Gnostic prophecy of Sophia's return was always described as a process, a gradual brightening. Like dawn, you can't point to the exact moment darkness becomes light, but you can look around at a certain point and recognize it's not night anymore. Let me show you the specific signs that the text pointed to, the markers that would indicate the Great Return was beginning. The first marker, the collapse of the authority of external mediators. When the age turns, when Pisces gives way to Aquarius, the structures that position themselves between the human soul and divine reality would begin to lose their hold. Not through violent revolution, through a quiet withdrawal of inner consent. People would simply stop finding them convincing. That is happening. Measurably, across the Western world, the authority of institutional religion to define reality for the people within it is declining in ways that have no historical precedent in the Christian era. The second marker, the return of suppressed knowledge. The Gnostic texts said that what had been hidden would be found again, that the sealed jar would be opened, that the buried tradition would surface. In 1945, it did, and it has been working its way outward ever since. From Coptic scholars in Cairo to James Robinson's translation team, to Elaine Pagels's best-selling books, to university curricula, to YouTube videos watched by people sitting in their homes, asking the questions that the tradition was built to answer. The third marker, the reawakening of inner experience as the primary category of spiritual authority. Not doctrine, not institution, not the correct recitation of inherited beliefs. Direct inner knowing, the explosion of contemplative practice, of inner life exploration, of every tradition that prioritizes experiential knowing over external authority. This is the third marker. And it is everywhere. The fourth marker, the one that I find most profound, is in the astrological and cosmic framework. The precession of the equinoxes places us, right now, at the cusp of the shift from Pisces to Aquarius. Not in some distant future. Now, the exact timing of the precessional shift is debated among astrologers and astronomers, but the range that most serious scholars work with places the transition between approximately 1950 and 2150. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 falls within that window. So does the entire modern explosion of Gnostic scholarship, contemplative practice, and alternative spirituality. The timing is not random. Now, the Vatican's continued silence on these texts, 80 years of it, tells you something that I think is actually very significant. It tells you that the institution understands, at some deep structural level, that serious engagement with the Nag Hammadi texts would require it to do one of two things. Either dismiss them as irrelevant, which is increasingly difficult to defend given their historical authority, or engage with them honestly, which would require reckoning with a version of early Christian thought that challenges the Church's entire account of its own origins and authority. Neither option is survivable on the institution's own terms. So silence. But silence is not suppression. Not anymore. The texts are translated. They are available. They are being read. The tradition they carry is alive, not in a single institution, not in a single movement, but in the interior lives of millions of people who may never have heard the name Sophia, but are nonetheless living the questions she was built to answer. What does the prophecy ask of you? What does Sophia's return actually require? I don't think it requires you to join anything. I don't think it requires you to adopt a new belief system. I don't think it requires you to reject whatever tradition you were born into or have chosen. I think it requires a quality of inner attention that most of us have been systematically trained out of. A willingness to sit in genuine stillness and take seriously the possibility that the deepest knowing available to you is not going to arrive from outside, not from a teacher, not from a text, not from a video on the internet, but from within. From the Sophia spark that the Gnostics believed every human being carries. From the quality of inner recognition that the alchemists called the living gold. From whatever that thing is, the thing that is present in your deepest moments of genuine clarity, that feels older and wiser and more fundamentally real than your ordinary thinking. The age that is beginning does not belong to a new institution. It does not belong to a new doctrine. It belongs to anyone willing to turn inward with enough courage and enough stillness to actually meet what's there. And that brings me to what I actually want to leave you with. We've traveled a long way together in this video, and I don't want to give you a recap. You were here. You know what we covered. What I want to do instead is leave you with the feeling of it, the shape of the journey we just took, because I think that feeling is more important than any specific fact we encountered along the way. We started with a name, Sophia, and we discovered that behind that name was not a myth, not a symbol, not a poetic metaphor for general human intelligence. Behind that name was a tradition, ancient, sophisticated, internally coherent, that described divine wisdom as a living cosmic force, present in reality, accessible within each human being, and fundamentally incompatible with the institutional model of religion that the early church was building. We discovered that the suppression of this tradition was not accidental. It was deliberate, systematic, and extraordinarily effective for 17 centuries. We discovered that the sealed jar Muhammad Ali al-Salman opened in the Egyptian desert in 1945 contained not just old texts but a living teaching, preserved in the dark, waiting for the moment when the age would turn and the conditions for its return would be right. We discovered that she never fully left, that she survived in Kabbalah as the Shekinah, in the Hebrew scriptures as Chakma, in Eastern Orthodox mysticism as the Holy Wisdom, in alchemical tradition as Sapientia, in the Gothic cathedrals as the Black Madonna, and the Vesica Piscis and the deep blue of Mary's robe. We discovered that in the Gnostic text Pistis Sophia, Mary Magdalene was not a fallen woman. She was the human vessel most fully carrying Sophia's light, and that she was deliberately erased and degraded as part of the same suppression strategy that destroyed the texts. And we discovered, and this is the part one most want you to hold, that the most important dimension of all of this is not historical. It's personal. The spark of Sophia's light that the Gnostic teachers said exists at the core of every human being. That is not a nice metaphor. That is a description of something you can verify, not by studying ancient texts, but by going quiet enough, still enough, to actually notice what's already there. Now I want to ask you something. And I don't want you to answer me. I want you to answer yourself. What do you know, not think, not believe, not hope? What do you know in the deepest, most settled part of your interior life that you have never been able to fully justify through reason or defend through argument? What is the quality of knowing that arises in you in moments of genuine stillness? The knowing that feels more real than your ordinary thinking, that seems to carry a kind of certainty that has nothing to do with evidence or logic. That is the question the ancient teachers were pointing toward. That is the question that the Sophia tradition, across all its different languages, across all its different centuries and traditions and names, has always been asking. Not what do you believe, but what do you know? The difference between those two questions, the entire distance between those two questions, is the distance between the spiritual world we have been living in for 2,000 years and the world that is beginning. Sophia's return is not an external event waiting to happen. It happens in the moment of genuine inner recognition. It has always been happening. The question, the only question, is whether you are still enough to notice. Now I need to say something directly. YouTube has officially demonetized this channel to keep your mind sanitized. They are terrified of exactly this kind of knowledge. I refuse to bend to their advertisers. I won't be silenced. In fact, I am going harder, but I cannot hold this ground alone. I need your support to keep this work alive. If this video cracks something open in you, click the link in the description and join me on Patreon right now. The moment you do, you will unlock unfiltered, esoteric member-only videos, exclusive audio podcasts, and the forbidden material they will never allow me to publish here. Most people will scroll right past this and go back to sleep. You're not most people.